Hello, it's Matthew here from Nations of Sanity, doing a second video reply to Brandon Cropper. Brandon done 2 video replies to my last video reply to him, so I just want to address the points that he made in those videos. And I'm actually going to start off with the last part of his first video reply, because Brandon thinks he's got me on a contradiction here. I just want to explain how I'm not contradicting myself, and Brandon seems to have misunderstood what I've said, which may well be down to me not explaining myself properly, but this is what Brandon had to say in his first video. And now we're jumping back to video 1, Brandon's first video, where we're still talking about the issue of threats and attempts to initiate force against people.
But the idea that people can use force to defend against non-aggression principle violations does not restrict them to after-the-fact responses. So you can act before somebody actually attacks you.
You're not restricted to after-the-fact responses. Right? The grammatical inversion of that is, you are allowed to act before the fact. You're not restricted to after the fact, so you are allowed to act before the fact. So, he says, you don't have to wait. You can act before, okay?
You can do a preemptive action on people. And it does allow them to act in response to threats or attempts to initiate force against peaceful people.
So if someone threatens you or attempts to initiate force against you, you can blank out. What can you do to them, Matthew? What can you do to them?
So you're saying that you would allow people to go out and attack people who have done nothing. But
can you do that then, Matthew? Can you go out and attack people who have done nothing?
No, you can't attack people who've done nothing. But I think the source of the confusion here is someone who threatens or attempts to initiate force is not somebody who's done nothing. So when I say you can't just attack people who've done nothing, I'm saying you can't attack people who've done nothing. But you can use force against people who are threatening or attempting to initiate force against you. So does that make sense now? When I say you can't attack people who've done nothing, that's because people who've threatened or attempted to initiate force against you, that's not doing nothing. That's threatening or attempting to initiate force against you. So you can't attack people who've done nothing, but you can use force against people who are threatening you or attempting to initiate force against you.
The person who goes and attacks them says that they feel like the person was going to do something.
That's what he says. He says, if you think someone's going to do something, you can go, it's defensive.
No, you can't.
Yeah, no, you did. You said it, Matthew. You said it. Are you this sloppy of a thinker, dude? This is pretty bad, Matthew.
Just attack somebody who's done nothing just because you said or you think or you feel that there's some kind of threat to you or you thought that they might do something.
You can't, then. So somebody can be a real threat to you, actually planning to attack you, saying they're going to attack you, and you can't do anything until the attack comes then. Is that what you're saying, Matthew?
No, you see, this is the difference. If they are actually threatening you, and if they are actually attempting to initiate force against you, then you can use force against them. But when I say you can't just use force because you feel threatened, what I'm talking about there is, like, you feeling threatened is not enough. They have to actually be threatening you. And just to give you an example of what I'm talking about there, say you're a young woman on a empty train travelling late at night, and a group of young men get on the train. You might feel threatened, and it would be understandable that you would feel threatened, but those people are not actually threatening you. So just because you feel threatened, you wouldn't be justified in using force against them because they're not threatening you. You just feel threatened because of the scenario, because you feel in a vulnerable situation. So when I was saying that you can't just use force because you feel threatened, that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying it can't just be that you feel threatened. Now, obviously, if somebody is actually threatening you, then you would also feel threatened. But the qualifier for whether you can use force or not isn't you feeling threatened. The qualifier of whether you can use force is whether you're actually being threatened, or whether someone's attempting to initiate force against you. So that's the distinction that needs to be made there. So, and it goes back to the same thing when I say that you can't use force against someone who's done nothing, but threatening or attempting to initiate force isn't doing nothing, and you can use force against those people. So I hope I've made that clear now. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that issue with regards to threats. You can use force in response to threats to initiate force against you. You can use force against people who are attempting to initiate force against you, and obviously people that have initiated force against you. But you cannot just use force against someone who's done literally nothing. And by literally nothing, I mean they haven't even threatened or attempted to initiate force against you. That's what I'm saying when you can't use force against people who've done nothing. Okay, so I wanted to be clear on that. Now we're going to go back to the beginning of his video, his first response video to my last video reply, and this is what he had to say.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not averse to repeating myself once in a while. This is Matthew Sands. He's done a video reply to my video reply to him.
And that's what the Nations of Sanity is about, making that principle the law, the universal law, established through a peace agreement, and it is our assertion...
That's this guy. The peace agreement. The law that's the peace agreement. Well, is it a law or is it a peace agreement? Let's see if I can get that a little... That's better, right? I don't know if it's better or worse. I don't know if it matters. Alright. Is it a law or is it a peace agreement? No, it's the law established through a peace agreement. How many people need to do it? I don't know. So that's this guy.
This is the only way to create a truly free society where everybody has truly equal rights.
What? You didn't go over that at all. The only way to do this is through this agreement?
Okay, that's actually a fair point. I didn't qualify that in any way. That was just part of my little introduction to people who weren't already familiar with Nations of Sanity. I have gone through the reason why we assert that it's the only way we can have equal rights in other videos and in other content, but just to go through that now, basically, as I've said before, the whole idea of the non-aggression principle is based on the concept of self-ownership, that you have right over yourself and only over yourself. From what I understand, this is how Brandon defines freedom and rights, so we kind of seem to be on the same page on that front. So when I say that the only way we can have equal rights is if the non-aggression principle is the law, is because if the non-aggression principle is the law, then the only right that is being enforced is your right to yourself, your right to your own life, and to do what you want with your own life, as long as you're not interfering with that exact same level of freedom that everybody else has, and that exact same right of self-ownership that everybody else has. So this is the point. This is why I say that it's the only way to have equal rights, is because it's the only right. It is protecting the only right that everybody can have in equal measure.
That requirement is clearly not lost on him, so he recognizes he needs to make it a law. In fact, it is part of why I assert that the non-aggression principle needs to be established as law. I thought laws were aggression.
No, laws are not aggression. The law against rape is not.
So here we're about to embark on a very confused and contorted conflation of rights. He doesn't know what rights are. He has no idea what rights are, and he has these things called self-ownership, and he has this thing called self-defense. And he has absolutely no idea what rights are. So, Matthew, let me just give you a little primer. There's nobody in this universe except individual human beings, and they're the only ones with rights. And the only types of rights they have are the right to their own life. That's it. So rights are pretty limited. Now, if that person violates somebody else's right to their life, then we can punish them. Otherwise, we have to leave them be. Okay? That's the principle. That's the only principle you need. Hurting other people, bad. Leaving other people alone, good. What that person does to themselves is none of our business.
I couldn't agree more. And that principle, that the only principle we need, that's called the non-aggression principle. I mean, what you just described is the non-aggression principle, that people have right over themselves and only over themselves, and as long as they're not hurting other people, they can do what they want. I mean, this is where I get a little confused where Brandon's problem is with this. I mean, I know obviously he doesn't like the idea of establishing it through a peace agreement, and that part of his objection is clear, and I can understand that. But what I don't understand is his objection to the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, when without saying those precise words and using those precise terms, that seems to be what Brandon's advocating as well. I mean, in a minute, Brandon will go on about how all the laws that violate the non-aggression principle, he won't say non-aggression principle, but he'll say all the laws that violate your rights and interfere with your freedom, as both he and me define it, are wrong, are illegitimate. And he said, and the only legitimate laws are the ones that protect rights. Now, I agree 100%. But that distinction is the non-aggression principle. Well, every single law that, and Brandon can correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to strawman him in any way, but every single law that Brandon himself acknowledges are the only legitimate laws are the laws that enforce the non-aggression principle, that protect everybody's rights as self-owning free individuals. Again, Brandon doesn't like to use the term self-ownership, and he doesn't seem to like to use the word, the term non-aggression principle. But we seem to be talking about the same thing. What Brandon calls freedom and what Brandon calls rights, I also call freedom and rights. Brandon thinks that I don't understand what rights are, and I do understand what rights are, and it seems that my definition of rights is exactly the same as Brandon's, pretty much. The difference is he doesn't seem to like using terms like self-ownership or the non-aggression principle, but when he's describing what he views as legitimate laws, he's describing laws that enforce the non-aggression principle. And when he's describing all the laws he said that he agrees are illegitimate and that shouldn't exist, he's describing all the laws that violate the non-aggression principle. So that's where it gets a little bit difficult to see exactly where Brandon's objection is. The only actual objection he seems to have with what I'm presenting here is, one, the terminology I'm using. He doesn't like terms like self-ownership or non-aggression principle. He just likes to use freedom and rights. And I've explained before, the reason why I don't just say freedom and rights is because not everybody has the same definition of freedom and rights. And that, you know, if you say freedom, there are some people that don't recognize the same definition of freedom, and they'll think freedom includes the right to violate others. And if you just say rights, there are people that believe in positive rights and think that, you know, protecting rights also means ensuring that I get free healthcare and a house paid for by other people and stuff like that. So, you know, this is why I use terms like self-ownership as well as using terms like freedom and rights. But the point of the matter is we're talking about the same thing. And it seems, and this is where I want Brandon to correct me if I'm wrong. Like I say, I don't want to strawman him in any way, but it seems to me that every single law that Brandon says is a legitimate law are the laws that enforce the non-aggression principle. And every single law that Brandon himself says shouldn't exist and are wrong, what he calls bad laws, are laws that violate the non-aggression principle. Now, what I'm saying is the way we solve that problem is to make the non-aggression principle the law. So what Brandon calls good laws are the only laws that can exist. And all the bad laws are non-starters. They can't exist because the non-aggression principle is the law. Rather than having laws that are imposed by some ruling authority and having the laws be based on the whims of whoever, you know, is controlling these ruling authorities, whether it's democratic, whether it's a dictator, single dictator, whatever whatever it is, whether it's a monarchy, whatever. The fact of the matter is when we have laws that are established by a ruling authority rather than being based on a principle, then you're going to get bad laws and good laws. You're going to get a mixture of both. But when you have the law based on the non-aggression principle, then you can only have the good laws. You can only have the laws that are protecting people's rights and that are enforcing the non-aggression principle. And every other law would not be allowed because it would be violating the non-aggression principle.
Now, I know that today drugs are illegal and so on. I know that the governments today have stupid laws. I'm not talking about that. You're talking about some principled anarchist society, and I'm talking about the principles that society ought to run on. The principles that society ought to run on is that you can't hurt other people, and they can't hurt you. That's the only principle that society ought to, that force that ought to be used on or for, is to protect your rights.
And that principle is the non-aggression principle.
Now, he's going to go through, he's going to say that drugs should be legal because of self-ownership or some garbage like that. You know, just a bunch of nonsense. You're just getting yourself into a mess. Even if you come out to the same answers as me, it took you 9 years to work out your garbage. And I didn't have to take that long. All I said was, did it hurt somebody else? No, then it's legal. Jump off a bridge, is that legal? Did it hurt anybody? Only you. Okay, you can do it. As long as it didn't hurt anybody else.
You see, at this point, me and Brandon are kind of saying the same thing. We're both saying that the only time force can be used, or should be used, is to protect people's rights. That's the non-aggression principle. So this is why I say the non-aggression principle should be law, because that is the only time when force should be used against you. That's the only time when you're committing a crime, is when you're violating the non-aggression principle. I mean, that's kind of the crux of this, is the non-aggression principle is defining crime. It doesn't cover all morality. We all have our own personal ideals and morality that not necessarily covered by fully by the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle is just defining what's an actual crime, what's an actual act of aggression, what is an actual violation of your rights as a self-owning free individual.
The law against murder is not aggression. The law against theft is not aggression.
That's non-aggression, to have a law against murder. Well, here's a question for you. What if somebody commits murder? Who avenges them? Because the person who's around they're not there to go to their protection agency and lodge a complaint against their abuser.
Okay, this comes back to that question of who's going to enforce the non-aggression principle. Now, I thought I did answer this in my last video, but just to reiterate, as I said before, everybody has the right to enforce the non-aggression principle. Nobody has the obligation to enforce the non-aggression principle. The only obligation is that you don't violate the non-aggression principle, but everybody has equal right to enforce it. Now, you can still have a police force, and I think it would be a good idea to have specialised organisations that enforce the non-aggression principle. And I'm not just talking about private security firms. I mean, I'm talking you can actually have a public serving police force that enforces the non-aggression principle just as we have police today. The difference would be is the non-aggression principle will be the only law they can enforce. They don't have any special rights beyond anybody else, because you don't need special rights or powers to enforce the non-aggression principle. Anyone has the right to do it, but obviously a dedicated organisation would be better equipped to do it. So anyone can enforce the non-aggression principle. The police can enforce the non-aggression principle much as they enforce non-aggression principle laws today, but they can only enforce the non-aggression principle. They won't be able to enforce any other laws that violate the non-aggression principle, and also they can't be funded through the theft of taxation. So, you know, the question of how you're going to deal with enforcing the non-aggression principle, whether it is acting to prevent violations of the non-aggression principle or responding to violations of the non-aggression principle. When it comes to dealing with actual non-aggression principle violations, it doesn't have to be a whole lot different to how we approach it today. As I say, the law against murder today and the law against theft today and all the other laws that enforce the non-aggression principle are not acts of aggression, apart from the theft tax to taxation, which is how police are funded today. But when they actually go out and enforce laws against rape, murder, theft and assault, they are not violating the non-aggression principle by doing those things. So I hope that makes things clearer. I mean, people can still talk about how modern day police are funded through the theft of taxation, and there's obviously aggression attached to that.
Taxation's adjusted by people that we vote for. It goes up and down over time, right? Now, of course, if you don't pay your taxes, a man with a gun comes. But Matthew, let me just ask you, how would you have it in your society? Would you have it 5% or 10%? You think would be sort of a reasonable amount that people would pay for the government? I mean, you admit that they would pay something, right? And it wouldn't be government, right? It'd be some sort of stupid protection agency, right? But how much exactly do you think people are going to pay? 5%, 10, 20, 30, 50? I mean, right now it's around 40 in America and like 60 in Canada, and probably 70 in Europe. I don't know. But what do you think it should be? Where do you think it should be? What would you willingly, voluntarily pay? Now, if you would willingly, voluntarily pay 20%, let's say, and today in America it's at 40%, then we're roughly about double where we are. Is that call for violent revolution, destroying society and starting over? Is that call for chucking out all the laws and all the jurisprudence we've built up over hundreds of years? Because you want to cut tax rates in half and have them be voluntary, admittedly? Like, you're so mad that it's not voluntary taxation. And I'm with you on that. I'm particularly upset about taxation without representation, right? That's the real beef, right? So as long as we have representation, we have a say in how much our taxes are, let's just admit that we're going to pay something for our government. Can you admit that? We're going to pay something for police, courts, military, right? What's it going to be? 10%? 20%? Now, I admit that it would be lower in a free society. I admit that drugs should be legal. Sure, I admit these things, but we're still going to have some sort of money we're going to have to pay. What is your violent revolution? Why are you throwing out the society we have? How much better is it going to be? Half as much taxes? I mean, why is this? What is this revolution about?
Okay, when it comes to taxation, the issue is whether it's voluntary or not. It's not about how much you pay. I mean, how much would be fair to pay, you know, depends on what you're getting in return and stuff like that. So it's not so much about what the percentage should be. It's about the fact that you don't have a choice. It's about the fact that tax is taken from you under the threat of force, which is basically what makes taxation theft. So the issue with taxation isn't about the percentage, whether it's a fair amount that you're paying. It's the fact that it is taken from you without your consent. That is the issue. So when it comes to how things would operate in a free society, I agree with you. What would be required to fund, I don't like calling it government, because as I said before, government is a ruling entity as far as I'm concerned, but let's say a voluntary version of government. When it comes to funding something like that, the issue isn't how much is required or how much would be fair or anything like that. The issue is whether it is voluntary or whether it is taken from you via force. And one of the taxations that can actually be retained, but I would say that it wouldn't be taxation anymore, or at least it wouldn't be coercive, it would be a voluntary alternative, is sales tax, the taxes that are applied to what's bought and sold in the regulated market. Over here in England, we call it VAT. I think in America, I think it's called sales tax. But basically, it's the tax that's applied to trade in the regulated market, both what you buy and what you sell. Now, the reason why this particular tax could be retained, whereas things like income tax and property taxes and that would just be gone, they're a non-starter. Again, unless people voluntarily wanted to sign up to such things. So the reason why the regulated market could retain this sales tax, although I would argue it would be a regulation fee rather than a tax, because it would become a voluntary thing rather than something that's taken under the threat of force. But the reason why this can be maintained is because if you're going to use the regulated market, then this fee, this tax, whatever you want to call it, would just be something that you're paying to use the regulated market, whether you're a business that's selling in the regulated market or you're a consumer buying in the regulated market. You're basically making an agreement. If you want to trade in the regulated market, then you have to pay this fee. Just like if you walk into a restaurant, you have to pay for the meal that you order. But the difference is, the reason why it's voluntary is because you don't have to eat in the restaurant, just like you don't have to use the regulated market. Now, in today's society, you do have to use the regulated market. Unregulated trade, or the black market, as it's often called, is illegal. So you're literally not allowed to trade outside of the regulated market. Whereas in a free society, you won't be obliged to use the regulated market. If you want to trade with somebody completely unregulated, you are free to do so. But if you want to use the regulated market, then you would have to pay the fees associated with that. And the reason why that is voluntary, like I say, it's just the same as if you go to a restaurant and pay for a meal. Obviously, it's not voluntary that you pay for your meal, but it is voluntary that you go to the restaurant and use that for your dining experience. So the same goes with the regulated market. If you use the regulated market, then you have to pay this fee. You have to pay this tax or whatever you want to call it. But you don't have to use the regulated market. So it is ultimately voluntary. If you want to use the regulated market, then this is the cost you pay for using that regulated market. And in return, you're getting the regulation that's provided by this voluntary collective, which is what I would call government in a free society. I would call them voluntary collectives. Brandon might still call them government because we might define government slightly differently. As I've said before, I define government as being a ruling entity. So under the non-aggression principle, a ruling government couldn't exist, but a entity that doesn't violate the non-aggression principle, which I would call a voluntary collective, can exist. And if Brandon wants to call that government, then that's fine. I'm not going to quibble over words, as long as we both understand what we're talking about here.
Simply having a law against rape is itself non-aggression. Having a law against any kind of drug use, for example, or having a law against gambling, or having a law against prostitution, is aggression. And the difference is...
Now, I can solve that for you. Just change those laws. Okay? Now maybe he's not an anarchist. I don't know. Are you in favor of government? No, you don't want government, right? The government's bad, right? That's right, it's agreement. Everything's agreement.
Law against rape is just a defensive act. It's a declaration of force on...
All laws, all proper laws, all good laws, all objective laws are defensive, Matthew. All objective laws are defensive. Now, you might go out and find some law that's not defensive and attacks somebody, and I'll say, okay, let's get that off the books. As a philosopher, I can't defend it and won't defend it, okay? All defensible laws are defensive laws, okay? They defend individual rights. All legitimate law is of this kind. So for you to sit here and say, there's this kind of law that we should do this, and that kind of law we should do that, and the non-aggression principle, blah, 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 blah. It's nonsense. This is all just garbage.
Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. As Brandon, in his own words, says, that all laws that just defend your rights, all laws that just protect your rights, that are, as he says, are defensive, they're the only legitimate laws. And he won't defend any of the laws that go outside of that. Okay, again, you're describing the non-aggression principle. Every law you describe as legitimate is ones that enforce the non-aggression principle, and every law that you describe as illegitimate, that you as a philosopher will not defend, are laws that violate the non-aggression principle. So, like I say, I just don't understand why you say that it's garbage to claim that the non-aggression principle should be the law, when, without using the exact same language as me, you're kind of saying the same thing. I mean, we might still disagree on it being applied through a peace agreement rather than through a ruling entity, and I do think that is the real area where we actually have a proper disagreement. But the basic idea that that the non-aggression principle should be the law, and the only laws that should exist are the laws that enforce the non-aggression principle, and laws that violate the non-aggression principle shouldn't exist, that seems to be something that we're on the same page as. Yet, for me, the obvious answer to that is, well, rather than individually begging your ruling authority to change all these laws that we know are wrong and keep all the laws we know are right, if we just make the non-aggression principle the law, then all of that just becomes self-evident. We don't have to individually lobby for every individual law and constantly have the argument. We've got this principle. We've got this principle that says if the law is protecting your rights as a self-owning individual, then it's not aggressive. It is a defensive law that's just protecting you, and it's completely legitimate. If the law is trying to impose on you outside of that, then it is violating the non-aggression principle. It's not protecting your rights, it's actually violating your rights, and therefore it's completely illegitimate. And if the non-aggression principle is the law, that is exactly how it would be. Yeah, this is where I get a bit confused, where Brandon's sort of so contemptuous of the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, when, without using the exact same language, he seems to be advocating basically the same thing, just, you know, advocating a different methodology for getting it done. So it's not that law is an act of aggression. Some laws are an act of aggression that exist today because they violate our self-ownership. This is also the difference, and I'll touch on this later, but this is also the difference between ruling people and not ruling people. Again, prohibiting somebody from rape, murder, or theft is not ruling them. Again, that's just defending yourself or defending others. But having a law that says somebody can't use whatever drug they want to use, or they can't sell their body, or they can't gamble, or that sort of stuff, that is ruling them. So this is a distinction that I need to make clear with...
What if they were just elected to office and they passed this junky law and now they're out of office? Am I being ruled over by those people? That's a junky concept, ruling over other people. That's stupid. A law was made that is in violation of people's rights. We need to argue about it in our courts and in our legislative bodies and get it changed.
Okay, but why was a law made that violates your rights rather than protecting it? Because we have a system where we are ruled by a ruling authority that makes up whatever laws they like. You know, if you have a ruling authority that has the power, has the right to either protect or violate your rights, then you're going to get some laws that protect and some laws that violate it. This is the problem with giving a government the power to violate your rights. Inevitably, they're going to violate your rights if they have that power, if they have that right. The idea of making the non-aggression principle as the law is to make it so that they don't have those powers. If the non-aggression principle is the law, then you can't have laws that violate your rights. You can only have laws that protect your rights. So, you know, I actually find it quite ridiculous to think that the best way to prevent us from having laws that violate our rights is to have a ruling authority that has the power and the right to violate our rights, and then just try to fight every individual law on an individual basis, when we should fight it on a principle level, when we should fight it on an overall level, where we basically say, okay, it's not just that you can't stop us from taking drugs. It's not just that you can't stop us from gambling or stop us from doing this. It's the overall principle that we own ourselves. We have right over ourselves. That is our freedom. That is our rights. And nobody has the right to violate that. Whether you're a king, whether you're a ruling government, whether you're a democracy, a dictatorship, it doesn't matter what you are, a republic, whatever. It is, and this is why I say you can't rule people. Or Patrick has a real bee in his bonnet about this whole ruling people. This is the crux of ruling people. It's the same distinction as it is between aggressive and defensive laws. That same distinction also separates laws that rule you from laws that aren't ruling you. So, like I say, laws that enforce the law against rape, murder, theft, and assault, they're not ruling you, and they're not laws of aggression. They are acts of defense. But laws that say you can't take this drug, laws that say you can't gamble, laws that say you can't sell your body, and all of that sort of stuff, those laws are ruling you because they're interfering with your freedom. That's what ruling is. It's violating your freedom. It's authority over your lives. And the whole point of self-ownership, I know you hate that term, but the whole point of freedom as you define it, or as rights as you define it, the whole point of that is that you have right over yourself and only over yourself, and no one else has right over you. And as long as you're not interfering with anybody else's freedom and rights, then you should be free to do what you want. That is the principle that the non-aggression principle basically represents. That is the non-aggression principle. That is self-ownership. As much as you hate the term, That's what we mean when we say self-ownership. You want to call it freedom? That's fine. Freedom works for me. That is also how I define freedom. That is how I define rights. As I said before, I use the term self-ownership just to clarify to people who have different definitions attached to rights and freedom of what, so I'm clear, so they're clear on what I'm talking about. But the fact of the matter is the idea that you have right over yourself is something that should be established as law, and that's what making the non-aggression principle the law would achieve. All the time you have a ruling government that has the authority to make laws that violate your rights rather than just the laws that protect your rights, then you have a government that's ruling you. Then you have a government that's aggressing against you and violating your rights as a free individual.
A law was made that is in violation of people's rights. We need to argue about it in our courts and in our legislative bodies and get it changed. It's not like a mind-bending, difficult thing.
And he says it's not a mind-bendingly difficult thing to just change the laws that violate our rights, but it's proven a pretty difficult thing because we still have all these laws that violate our rights. So you don't seem to be too in touch with reality there by saying, oh, it's not a difficult thing. Like it's that simple. If it's that simple, then why do we have all these laws that violate our rights? You know, if it's that simple to just get it changed under the current system, then we wouldn't have all these laws. Like I say, the reason why we have these laws that violate our rights is because we give that authority to our government to violate our rights. So all the time you have somebody that has the power to violate your rights, then you shouldn't be surprised when that's exactly what they do. When you replace their rule with a law that says that no one has the right to rule over anybody, no one has the right to violate anybody, and we all have the exact same equal rights, which is the right over ourselves and only over ourselves, that is when you get rid of all those bad laws.
And I'll say, bad laws always get passed. They're always going to get passed. They're always going to have to be rewritten. The best thing that we can do is set down a lot of strictures on the government to stop them from even trying to write lots of different types of laws. And just say, if it's concerning this, you can't write a law about it. If it's about this, you can't write a law about it. If it's about this, you can't write a law about it. And just go on and have a whole list of them. The United States started out with a nice list of 10, and we've lengthened it.
Well, you don't need a list of 10. You just need a list of 1. You just need the non-aggression principle as the law and the basic assertion that everybody has right over themselves, and that's it. That takes care of everything else. You don't need all these individual ones. The reason why and this is something you've just said yourself, we're always going to have bad laws. We're always going to get bad laws passed. That's because we have a ruling authority that has the right and power to pass bad laws to violate our rights. And the solution to that, you say the only thing we can do is, make sure that we prevent government from being able to make bad laws. Well, having a law that sits above them that says that the only law that can be established is the non-aggression principle would achieve that. That would do that. That would make it so that they can't pass bad laws because they wouldn't have the power to. They wouldn't have the right to. Like I say, right now, all the time we accept ruling authorities that have the power to rule over us, then we're going to have bad laws that rule over us, that violate our rights. But when you have a law that's established through a peace agreement that basically says that no one is allowed to rule over anybody and that everybody has the same equal rights, then you're not going to have those laws because it violates the overall law.
And then obviously anybody else who's watching this, this is the difference. And this is the point of having the non-aggression principle be the law. Because enforcing the non-aggression principle is just an act of defence, whether it's defending yourself.
How about we take this non-aggression principle, which essentially is you have the right to your life and nobody can violate your right to your life. How about we just take that as our guide in life and try to get the laws in our society changed to reflect that?
Or actually establish that principle as the law. So rather than just having it as some vague guide that we kind of use as a guidance to try to persuade our ruling authorities not to violate our rights, why don't we just make it the law? You've said yourself, you seem to, this is the thing, you seem to now be connecting the dots yourself that the non-aggression principle is just protecting the basic rights that you yourself say are the only rights that everybody should have. So again, I don't understand what your objection is to making the non-aggression principle the law. I understand you still have a problem with making it the law through a peace agreement, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, but the basic idea of making the non-aggression principle the law seems to not be too far away from precisely what you're advocating, but you're saying rather than making the non-aggression principle the law in one foul sweep, let's use it as a guide and individually try to change individual laws. Every time a bad law comes up, we'll challenge it. Every time a good law comes up, we'll try to keep it. Just make the non-aggression principle the law, and that takes care of it all. We don't need to keep repeating ourselves. We don't need to keep having the same arguments when every individual law comes up. We can have the one law that sets what can and cannot be deemed a crime, what can and cannot be enforced as law.
Right? Get the taxes lowered or even reduced to zero so that people can pay as much as they feel appropriate. Sure, let's do that. Why would you take exception to that?
Why would you take exception to the idea of the non-aggression principle being established as law when you basically are on board with it, but just through a different methodology? I mean, as I say, this is where I'm trying to pinpoint exactly what Brandon's issue is with the Nations of Sanity. As far as I can tell, he has a problem with the idea of it being established as law through a peace agreement. And I'm going to come to why I think that's preferable to doing it through a ruling authority. But the issue of making the non-aggression principle the law, up till now, everything Brandon has said seems to suggest that he has a problem with that idea in itself. Yet he then says things that suggest that he's supportive of that idea, because he does agree that the non-aggression principle should only enforce he does agree that the law should only enforce the non-aggression principle, though he doesn't refer to it as the non-aggression principle. He refers to it as protecting rights, but we're basically saying the same thing here. So he does agree that the law should only enforce the non-aggression principle. He does agree that all laws that go beyond that and violate the non-aggression principle are illegitimate, are wrong, and he would want to get rid of those laws. Yet he doesn't want to establish the non-aggression principle as the law, even though it would achieve both those things. It would achieve making all of the proper laws law, and it would achieve getting rid of all of the bad laws. Like I say, I don't really understand where his objection is on this.
I mean, what is your universal standard? If this is what we should use as intellectuals in the courts and in our legal bodies when we're writing the laws, fine. Bring this to the jurisdiction. Bring this to the law schools. Write a book about the theory of law. That's what you're dealing with here, is the theory of law. You're dealing with the theory of law, and you dismiss law. I mean, law is telling people what they must never do, under punishment of men with guns pursuing them to the ends of the earth. And you're theorizing about things that people should never do under heavy, heavy punishment. You're theorizing about law. This is not law. This is not morals. This is law.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of made this point myself. The non-aggression principle doesn't cover all morality. It just defines crime. So yeah, I'm dealing with law. I'm dealing with what law essentially should be. Like you say, it's when we're saying people can't do something, and if they do it, people will use force against them. So you know, this isn't lost on me. I do understand that what I'm talking about is law, which is why the whole idea behind this is to make the non-aggression principle the law. I mean, as I say, I want to do it through a peace agreement, but I want to make it the law. That's what I'm trying to establish here. I'm trying to establish the non-aggression principle as the law. As I've said before, the reason why I'm doing it through a peace agreement rather than going to the ruling authorities and trying to do it through them is because this specific law makes ruling authorities illegal. So I want to establish the non-aggression principle as law. I want to do it consistently and without contradiction. And that's why I say the only way that we can establish the non-aggression principle as law is through the peace agreement, is making it the terms of this peace agreement. And this goes back to my claim about why this is the only way to create a free society with truly equal rights, because as we've both seem to agree, the right of self-ownership, or freedom as you would call it, the right over yourself and only over yourself, is the one and only right that everybody can have in equal measure. The non-aggression principle is the principle that's based on that concept, and the non-aggression principles law would protect those rights and only those rights. So that would be equal rights. If you had a ruling authority that violated the non-aggression principle, then that's not equal rights. That's not the law applying to everybody equally. That's the law applying to everybody equally below the government, and then the government are separate, and anybody who's part of or controlling that government has a special right or authority or power over others. So then that wouldn't be equal rights. So the point of the non-aggression principle is that it is protecting the basic rights that everybody can have equally, and the only way to establish the non-aggression principle as universal law, so it is literally applying to everybody without exception, is to establish it through a peace agreement rather than a ruling authority, because a ruling authority violates the non-aggression principle. Why it specifically needs to be this three-part peace agreement, where you have the basic agreement established through...
There's no agreement about law. People are going to interpret it differently. And you say, we don't care what your interpretation is. We've written down that you cannot break into other people's houses. We don't care if you're hungry. We don't care if they were a Christian and you're a Muslim and Muslims have a right to terrorize Christians. We don't care. We are going to lock you up. We don't care about your interpretation. We don't care about your universal. We don't care about your agreement. We don't care if you were part of agreement. We don't care if you don't agree with our agreement. We're just going to lock you up if you do what we don't think is right. Now, Matthew, do you want to be part of that discussion and help us decide what is right and wrong? Because if so, you're going to, I suspect you're going to sit down at the table and say things like, we need to legalize drugs and legalize prostitution, right? Because they don't hurt anybody's right. And I'm going to say, should we make murder legal? And you're going to say, no, of course not. Well, okay. Then we're going to have a government, and we're going to have laws, and we're going to have police enforcing it. And it doesn't matter whether people agree or not. So just drop that stupid language. That is just kindergarten language.
Yeah, I mean, as I have already said, this peace agreement is just a way of establishing the non-aggression principle as the law, rather than doing it through a ruling authority. But it will be the law. It's, like I say, it's going to apply to everybody. It's not just going to apply to people that have agreed to it. The requirement to get people to agree to it is just about establishing it as law, which is why I say I can't give you an exact number on how many people need to agree, because it's just however many we need to get it done. And as you yourself have said, it doesn't necessarily need to be a democratic majority. You know, it's just about establishing it as law. If a super advanced alien race came down tomorrow, and came up to me and said, hey Matt, we like the cut of your jib, we're going to support this whole making the non-aggression principle law as a peace agreement, we're going to enforce that as law, we'll back you militarily or whatever. In that scenario, it's still a peace agreement. I'm not the ruler. The super aliens aren't the ruler. The non-aggression principle is established as the law, as a peace agreement. It's the terms of peace between all people, and it will be enforced on anybody regardless of their agreement. And also, another point, and this cuts to the definition of ruling. In that scenario, we wouldn't be ruling anybody. If we're only enforcing the non-aggression principle, then you're not ruling anybody. Okay, now we're going to move on to the second video that Brandon done replying to my last video. And in this one, he mainly speaks about the concept of ruling people. So I'm going to mainly kind of try to make that clear what I'm talking about when I talk about ruling people. I have obviously touched on that already with some of my comments about the difference between aggressive laws and defensive laws being basically the same as being the difference between laws that rule you and laws that, again, they're just defensive laws. So, I'm hoping that I've made myself clear already, but I'm just going to obviously go through his points in the third video, and hopefully address and make clear what I'm talking about when I talk about ruling people.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a guy here who lives in a statist society. he can't conceive of anything other than statism. He doesn't believe anything besides statism exists anywhere in the world. And he believes that statism and ruling others are equivalent. And he has a word in his mind which he can't define. He knows it in his bones. And that's why I say he's in a statist society. He can't conceive of anything but a statist society. And this word really is at the core of his thoughts, and he uses it reflexively and instinctively. And so we're at 1440 in this video, a video response to Brandon Cropper, Nations of Sanity. The word is rule. Okay? Watch this.
Okay, the peace agreement is essentially serving as kind of like a constitution. I mean, that's basically setting the rules for which we play. Just like
Ignore that use of the word rules.
America has a constitution that dictates how government can act. The peace agreement will serve like a constitution that dictates how everybody can act, including government. Although, and I need to speak to Brandon about how he defines government, because I define government as a ruling entity, and
there's the issue, a ruling entity. The government is the ruling entity. Now, I define government, for the record, Matthew, I define government as the police, the courts, and the military. If it steps outside those bounds, then it is a government run amok. It is a government that is unconstitutional. It is a government that is violating rights. So they can have the police, they can have courts, and they can have the military. Now, why do I allow them those three things? And only those three things. Why? Because those three things involve the use of physical force. And I don't want anybody using physical force for profit, right? That would be insane. See who can make most profit off of physical force? I don't want that. That's called slavery. So I don't want physical force to get mixed up with the profit motive, right? So I put physical force in at the government. And I tell the government, you're not allowed to make money anywhere. You have to subsist off of the money we give you. We make money. We produce stuff. The government serves us. The government does what we tell it to. Okay, that's how I define government.
Okay, a few little corrections are needed there. First of all, the money governments don't run on the money we give them. Governments run on the money that they take from us from force. Let's be clear about that. We don't give them money. Well, we do give them money, but we give them money because we have no choice. We don't give them money voluntarily. They take it through force. So that's one of the many ways in which governments violate our rights. They rob us.
Now, sometimes the government does things it shouldn't, and it gets too big. And look at the United States of America right now. Like 23, 27, 29 states have legalized pot. So the laws go one way and they go the other. Not everything's perfect. But the government, and I would have a constitutional amendment which would stop the government from doing that kind of nonsense. You couldn't make it illegal to put chemicals in a person to put chemicals in their own body. Okay?
Well, it's good to know that you would also have a constitution that prevents government from violating our rights, but then the obvious question is in what way does that constitution differ from the peace agreement that I'm proposing? And certainly I'm not sure how it differs in the respect of making the non-aggression principle the law, because that's essentially what you... Again, this is what I'm talking about. I'm advocating that the non-aggression principle should be made law, and I'm saying that the only way to do it consistently is through a peace agreement. You seem to dispute both points, yet while your opposition to the peace agreement seems relatively consistent, your opposition to the non-aggression principle as law doesn't seem consistent, because so many times in both these reply videos, you have basically described what you think the law should be as the non-aggression principle. I mean, you won't use the term the non-aggression principle, but you basically seem to be describing it in the same way. And this is where I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to straw man you or misrepresent you in any way. But from what I can tell, you and me both agree that the laws that violate the non-aggression principle should not exist, and the laws that enforce the non-aggression principle are the only laws that are legitimate. It seems to me that both you and me agree on this. Even if you don't want to use the term non-aggression principle, you know what I'm talking about when I say that. So what is your issue with making the non-aggression principle the law? Putting aside the peace agreement side of it, just the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, I'm saying the non-aggression principle should be law. What are you saying? Are you saying it should or it shouldn't be? Or are you saying that we should try to make the non-aggression principle... are you saying that we should make the law as consistent with the non-aggression principle as we can without actually making the law the non-aggression principle? I mean, this is where I want you to clarify here, because this is an area where I think we're kind of on the same page, because some of the things you say suggest that we are, in the way that you define rights and freedom seems to be the same as I do, and in the way that you describe legitimate laws and distinguish legitimate laws from illegitimate laws seems to be based on the non-aggression principle, yet you find the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law ridiculous, despite it being kind of what you're advocating as well. As I say, I understand that establishing it through a peace agreement might be a different issue, but the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, I don't understand what your objection to that is, because it seems to be very similar to what you yourself are advocating, just through a different methodology.
But that's a side issue. So the government is those things which require the use of physical force. The police for physical force inside our borders, the military for physical force outside our borders, and the law courts to enforce physical force, to tell the police what to do and when to do it. Because the police don't really have brains without the courts. That's my definition of the government. Now, the people who run the government are voted into office and then are voted out. And while they're there, they are restricted in what they do by a written document we call the Constitution. Now, you live in Britain and you guys are screwed, and that's why I said at the very beginning of this video that you are a statist, you've grown up in statism, you don't know that anything else has existed. They probably haven't even explained the Constitution of the United States to you. You've probably never read it. And so you are like a child who hasn't learned to read yet, trying to think about legal principles. And you don't realize there's this thing called the alphabet out there. You've got to go learn the alphabet before you can learn to read. This is where you start. Now, your first step is going to be to read the Constitution of the United States and think about why that document wouldn't be utterly perfect for your project. Go through with a red pen and cross out the bits you don't like. Find in there, Matthew, go find in the Constitution of the United States where somebody rules over somebody. Because that's what you're so worried about. Can't rule over others. Don't rule over others. Now, why are you so worried about that? It's because you're queen and the garbage with your monarchy? Is that what you're up about?
Under that definition, government would be illegal under the non-aggression principle. But you can still have something like a government that doesn't actually apply.
All right. He says under that definition, government would be illegal. Under the definition of a government rules over other people. But that's not a definition, Matthew. You're just using the word rule. Now you need to define the word rule.
Okay, now I'm going to try and wrap this video up now, because I think I've addressed most of the points here, and I'm just going to make a sort of final summary, which I hope will clarify everything I've said and answer all the questions and points that Brandon has made and raised. So ruling people is, and this is the definition of ruling people, because this is the main crux of Brandon's second video, is he wants to know what I mean when I say ruling people. What is that? Okay, so ruling people is when you use force or the threat of force to control or compel other people's actions outside of defense. So, like I say, a law against rape, a law against murder, a law against theft, a law against assault, none of that are aggressive laws, and none of those qualify as ruling people, because it's just defense. But A law against taking a drug, a law against gambling, a law against prostitution, those are aggressive laws because then you're initiating force or threatening force against peaceful people, and it is ruling people because you are controlling or compelling them through the threat of force outside of just defense. So this is what ruling people is. This is the distinction, and this is when I say about this is why I define governments as ruling entities, and if you define government differently, this is why we need to clarify this, because if you don't define government as a ruling entity, then government could still exist theoretically in the free society that I'm advocating. If you do define government as a ruling entity, then government cannot exist in a free society that I'm advocating. So it's an important distinction. Now, the reason why it's an important distinction is because my point is the non-aggression principle needs to be universal law. It needs to apply to everybody. That's why I talk about it being the only way to have equal rights. If you have a ruling authority, a government that has the power and the rights to make up other laws that violate your rights and rule you, then obviously that's not equal rights. Even if everybody else, even if the rest of the citizenry are 100% equal in their rights, you've got this organization, however many people are running it or controlling it is irrelevant. Even if it's just one person, that's one person that's got rights that everybody else doesn't, who can set rules that other people can't, who can do things that other people cannot do. So that's not equal rights. That's not the law applied equally or universally. So this is the point of the Nations of Sanity. We want to make the non-aggression principle the law, because that is the only law that can be established and enforced equally to everybody. The right to yourself is the only right that everybody can have. That's the only thing that can be equal rights. You know, as I've said before, if you step outside of that, if you deal in things like positive rights, where, if I say I have a right to healthcare, then I'm obliging someone to provide me with healthcare, which is then interfering with their freedom to do what they want as long as they're not harming everybody. I don't have the right to oblige other people to provide me with stuff. The only obligation, if the non-aggression principle is the law, the only obligation is that you do not violate others. Like, that's why they often refer to the rights associated with the non-aggression principle as negative rights, because there's no positive obligation on other people. You're just saying that they've got to leave you alone. It's only the negative obligations of don't hurt me. There's no positive obligation of provide me with this or pay for this, or so this is an important distinction. To rule people is to use force or the threat of force to control or compel their actions outside of defense. So if you have a ruling authority that has the power to make other laws and other rules, then apart from the fact that it's quite predictable that they will do that, and the question, as you said in your previous video, we're always going to have bad laws. The reason why we're always going to have bad laws is because we have a government that has the power to make bad laws. And my point is we should take that power away from them. And the way to do that is to establish the non-aggression principle as universal law. Now, as far as establishing it through a peace agreement rather than through a ruling authority, as I've explained before, the reason why we have to do it that way is because a ruling authority would itself be a violation of the non-aggression principle. So it's a bit similar to how you establish your constitution. You're not saying these are the rules because I said so. We're saying this is the law based on the principle that everybody has right over themselves. That's the principle, the non-aggression principle. That's what the law is based on. It's not based on anybody's specific authority. It's based on this clear and objective principle, this universal definition of crime that identifies what is and isn't an act of aggression, what is and isn't a violation of somebody's rights and freedom. I think maybe one other way to help Brandon picture what I'm talking about is to perhaps describe how I would envisage this happening in the real world. So say, for example, we established the non-aggression principles law. What would that mean? How would things change? Like what would happen to governments? Now, my point is the idea of making the non-aggression principle the law is once you've done that, then governments would only be able to operate as what I call voluntary collectives. You can still call them government, it doesn't matter. But what I'm saying is they will no longer have the power to rule. They will no longer have the power to make any laws that we've already defined as aggressive laws that violate your rights. They would only be able to serve. This is the point. It's about having the same rules for everybody. It's about having us all have the exact same rights. And one of the problems with the whole idea about electing officials and giving government this authority is people give authority to government that they themselves don't have. So they don't have the authority to give it. Like, where does government's authority to rule people come from? No, I don't have the authority to rule over you, so I don't have the power to delegate that authority to somebody else. I can't vote for a government. Well, I can, but I shouldn't be allowed to vote for a government to rule over you because I don't have the power to rule over you. So where does the government get this power to rule over people? Why does the government have the right to make laws? They shouldn't. They don't. They shouldn't have that right. Like I say, if we have a free society defined by this basic concept of freedom and rights, which, as I say, we both seem to be on the same page on, we both seem to agree that rights are just the right over yourself. That's the only right that anybody has. You said that yourself. We all only have right over ourselves, and we should all be free to do what we want as long as we don't interfere with each other's same rights and freedom. So if that's true, if we all only have that right, then how will we be able to create a government that has extra rights, that has the power to rule over other people against their will or consent? And again, just to reiterate, my definition of ruling people is controlling or compelling their actions through the threat of force outside of defence. So enforcing laws against rape, not ruling people. Enforcing laws against murder, not ruling people. Which is why I say enforcing the non-aggression principle does not require the power to rule people. Anybody can do it. Not everyone's going to be able to do it from an ability point of view, but everybody has the right to do it. And although I'm totally in agreement with Brandon that I think that we should have a public serving organisation that does this, and I don't want profit motives attached to certain things. I mean, one other thing that I think I need to clarify with Brandon is I'm a voluntarist, not an ANCAP. So I don't go along with this idea that the free market can fix everything and profit motive is the answer for everything. I agree with Brandon that there are certain things that we don't want the profit motive attached to. And I also want us to have public serving organisations, not just private entities that run on the profit motive. So I'm kind of on the same page with Brandon on there. And with regards to having what I would call a voluntary collective, what Brandon may or may not call a government, depending on how he defines government, we can have that too. We can have these organisations that run just like governments do today. And this is a point I make to people sometimes, is it's important to understand that a free society might not look that different from the society that we have today. But the difference would be the consent. The difference would be that a government, or a voluntary collective as I would call it, would only be able to lead willing people. It would only be able to lead you on your consent, and it wouldn't be able to rule others. So if I want to elect some official to kind of take charge of whatever thing on my behalf, yeah, I can do that. But he doesn't have power over other people. He only has power over people that have given him that power over them. I don't have the authority to submit myself to somebody else's authority on a voluntary basis, but I do not have the authority to submit somebody else to someone's authority. So this is the difference between ruling and leading. We can still have leaders, because leading is done with consent. Ruling is done against your will, and that's why we can't have rulers anymore. We can still have leaders. We can still have voluntary collectives, but we can't have ruling governments. We can still have laws that protect your rights, but we can't have laws that violate them. That's the idea behind making the non-aggression principle the law. That's what it's all about. That's what the Nations of Sanity is about, and that is why we have this idea of making the non-aggression principle the law, established through a peace agreement. That is the only way to have a free society, and that is the only way to have truly equal rights for everybody.